Doing all the loan agreements, complicated. Extend lines. Hey.
My name is Claudia. I am the executive director of 100 State, which is where you are currently. 100 State is Wisconsin's largest co-working space. We have over 300 members that collaborate and work out of this space in different capacities, whether you be an entrepreneur, a freelancer, a creative, remote worker, nonprofit, anything under the sun. We have folks working out of our space. And so if you want to learn more, both myself and Meg, our community director, right there. We'll be around after and happy to talk to you a little bit more about what this space is. And so part of this space actually is, or included in our space, is our blockchain community. So about 8 months ago, we started a program called 100 Crypto with the focus on providing a space in a community and sort of a landing pad for folks involved in the blockchain space. And so there's actually there's a surprising amount of blockchain community activity happening in this city. And we wanted to sort of actually bring those people together, talk a little bit more about what was happening in the space, give people spaces to collaborate and work together, start projects together. And actually this fall, on September 22nd, we'll be hosting the first 24-hour hackathon in this space. Don't worry about it, we'll grab it later. So we'll be hosting the first 24-hour hackathon in this space focused on blockchain tech. So if you're interested, check out, Jason, what's the website?
madblockconference.com, and we can send out the link and the Eventbrite link as well.
So you'll be hearing about it
so you can find it
more later. But if you're interested in that, you do not have to just be a developer. There's a ton of different opportunities at hackathons beyond just coding. So definitely check that out. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Eric to get us started. So thanks, guys. Slight mic.
Sorry, mic's not working right now. Share.
There you go.
Cool, thanks. So my name's Eric Orthy. I run a meetup group in Madison called Madison Blockchain. And so I've had the privilege of getting to know our panelists today quite often over the last year. My co-founder and co-organizer of the meetups, Brooks, who's operating the camera right now. We host these meetups the first and third Monday of each month in this space in 100 State. So feel free to join our meetup group and be part of some of our conversations. So we have a great set of panelists here today. Just while we get started, let's go around and have each panelist introduce themselves.
Hi everybody, I'm Will Pangman. I'm relatively new to the co-working community here at 100 State and Madison also. I was born in Madison, but I never lived here until like less than a year ago. But I've been in the blockchain space for going on 6 years and trying to bring some of that experience here to the group here in Madison. I'm sure some of my answers will cover more of that, so I'll let Sid go next.
Hi everyone, my name is Sid Ramesh. I work at a startup called Dharma. We're building a platform for doing lending on blockchains like Ethereum. So I've lived in Madison for the last 4 years, moving to San Francisco soon. But I worked on a number of blockchain-related projects for the last 3 years. When I was at the university, founded Badger Blockchain, which is a student club, and then I started consulting on my own with a company called Chainguru for the last year. But yeah, I'll pass it over to Roz.
Hi, I'm Roz. Like Sid mentioned, I am the current president of Badger Blockchain, which is the blockchain education group at UW. Currently a student there, and then this past summer I was working in San Francisco at a company called Ripple. Who wrote that? Happy to answer questions. Yeah.
And I'm Brad Chandler. I'm actually at the university, so I'm in the finance department at the university. We're starting a new course this next fall called Cryptokitties, where we're going to be dealing with Bitcoin, blockchain, and hopefully providing some additional kind of educational resources for people, both students in the class, but also broadly for the community. So I'm very excited to be joining the panel and to help people think about what is blockchain and Bitcoin.
Awesome, thank you for doing that. So just as a reminder to our panelists and audience, this is a intro to blockchain discussion. So the most obvious first question I'm going to ask is, what exactly is blockchain? Does anyone want to get started with that? Let's go to Sid.
Okay, so, well, there's, first of all, many definitions for how you define a blockchain. I mean, there's one way to like define it from like the Bitcoin perspective and like sort of what the underlying technology behind that is. I'll give a kind of like a high-level explanation of how I think, how I think about blockchain. So first of all, I think it's like the underlying technology underpinning Bitcoin, which is like the first iteration of a digital currency that was decentralized and sort of not owned by like a single entity. So you can think of a blockchain as more so of like a distributed network that where like the ledger entries are actually not controlled by like one entity, but actually like owned and managed by multiple different participants in the network. And the way the ledger actually is managing its accounts and balances in the network is actually controlled by a computer science distributed network algorithm that maintains and keeps the account balances all updated constantly. And the network is sort of not maintained by like one entity, so it's like called decentralized networks. So I think of it more so as something where like you have a ledger of sorts that's like managed and run by a group of entities, and there's like no control among like one participant. So that's kind of like the high level sort of way of thinking about blockchain. And of course, like the software like that's like underpinning it has a combination of like traditional computer science algorithms from like distributed systems. It uses a lot of properties from applied cryptography, and then also has properties of economics built into the system. There's definitely like other ways to explain it, but Bitcoin is sort of like the first version of blockchain that tried to build a digital currency on top of a blockchain, and then now we've had a bunch of other iterations of blockchain technology, both on the public side through different digital assets, and then also sort of like on the private side, there are multiple enterprises that are trying to use blockchain. But yeah, that's kind of like the high-level explanation I can give.
I'll add to that. So I think I agree with Sid that there's a lot of disagreement about what exactly defines a blockchain, but I think to me the fundamental characteristic is that you can build a system that no one entity controls. So I'm going to steal from The Economist here. They referred to blockchains as a trust machine, which is a cool way to put it. Essentially, you're building something that nobody owns or has power over. So there's multiple parties that are contributing to that system. Usually that means getting data or like entries in a ledger for Bitcoin. But that could be applied to anything. It's a way of agreeing on things without one person saying what the truth is.
So I guess I think it's important to point out that a blockchain is just another kind of database. And this database, like Roz and Sid were saying, is something that every participant in the network updates and audits together and maintains a full copy of together. So it's a live syncing database that all the entries are collaboratively audited and updated. And I think that's a kind of simple, bare bones way to put it. The way I kind of picture it is blockchain isn't such a good image, these chains of blocks. It helps a little bit, but I like to think of it as you're burying the blocks. And the deeper, like every block that's newer buries deeper the ones below it. And so the deeper that a block is buried, the more immovable, irretrievable, irrevocable, immutable is the term that's thrown around a lot. The more immutable it is. So you're burying the blocks, and the ones previous are just, it's going to take a lot longer to unbury them, right?
So Will, can you talk a lot about blocks. Can you just define what exactly is in the block?
In the case of Bitcoin, inside the block are transactions or ledger entries. You think of it like, I have a stamp on a statement and I'm taking Sid's stamp and putting it over mine. Now it's Sid's, it can't be mine. So I guess a block is all of those that occur within 10 minutes, at least in the case of Bitcoin, an average of 10 minutes. And so it's every block that you're burying in my little example is full of transactions that the whole, let's say, world has conducted. Another little image I like to describe is like, most people don't keep a full copy of the blockchain, you know, if they're using Bitcoin and many other of these. So what's needed is like a jumbotron in the town square that shows all these transactions on the ledger like a giant checkbook, right? And that way all the townspeople can see that, you know? All the people in the network can see all those updates. They can walk up to the screen and watch it, you know, and then they trust that enough other people are watching it closely enough. And at least in the case of Bitcoin, it's true that enough people are burying blocks that the Jumbotron's reports are pretty reliable. You can, you know, the feed is reliable. It's so much more nuanced than that, but I really think it's simple to describe it as a database that's shared by everybody and updated together in real time. And then I think that burying story helps describe how unchangeable it is over time.
I'll make a comment about the blocks thing. So one big issue with distributed systems, especially when there's no one entity that dictates what is happening, is that you have an ordering problem, right? There's all these different computers all around the world that have different network speeds, and they might be receiving transactions in a different order. And if you just try and order all of those things that are happening, like agree on something, that's way more complicated than just saying, okay, these happen in this block, and then that happens, like that's block number 1, and then we take another set and then make that block number 2. And then you only have to order blocks rather than ordering this like huge mass stream of transactions.
Brett, anything to add to that?
No.
So you mentioned, so there's a lot of information that's stored in the block, but so who exactly owns the data that's being recorded on this? I mean, you talked about decentralized, but there has to be some ownership here, does there not?
No, the cool thing is nobody owns it. Or everybody, depending on how you look at it.
But then how do am I able to go back and make changes to records that I think are perhaps incorrect about something that's listed about myself?
Yeah, so the process in which like your data gets added to the blockchain, like once it's like rather called like finalized, so there's a network of computers that have to agree on a set of data. So if there's, you know, the data set can be transactions in Bitcoin, or it can be certain types of interactions on a decentralized application that like interfaces with, you know, what I call, you know, what they call smart contracts. But essentially, when the network agrees on a set of data, they actually come to what is known as consensus, where they agree on a shared set of information. Then that is like an immutable copy that cannot be changed, and is actually stored in this like, you know, stored in the blockchain and can't be tampered with. However, like technically speaking, there are ways in which you could probably, like, if you don't have the right copy of the ledger, if only certain people control it, then it's possible to change it. But when there's a consensus on the network and multiple people agree on the shared set of information, and once it's actually added to the blockchain, then it's not possible to go back and change the history.
So Brett, I'm going to throw this over to you now. So does that pose a problem in the financial space? I mean, if you're talking about large corporations managing and putting their data on a blockchain, does that pose a problem?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about it in conjunction with maybe non-blockchain solutions. So let's take a regular database that a company would have, you know, a centralized database that they would use, and maybe one of the problems is a coordination problem among them, right? Company A has a centralized database, company B does, company C does. They may not all agree on what the database says, but the good thing about a centralized database is they can change any of the records they want to, right? There's no record that can't be edited. So I think that's just a different way of thinking. And so I do think it presents a problem. Think about it maybe from a consumer perspective. When you use so if some of these cryptocurrencies want to be money, like Bitcoin wants to be, and think about it in ways in which you use your money. If you're using a credit card and you have a transaction that goes through, but it actually doesn't, you don't get the service, or there's something wrong with that transaction, you can always go back, between a certain period of time and revoke that transaction. So Bitcoin has none of that, right? The blockchain has none of that because as Sid was saying, once consensus is reached, that ledger, which can only be added to, is now in the record permanently. So sometimes I think about it in the traditional financial world as maybe being a little less customer friendly than what like a traditional credit card might be. But I think what you're seeing is, the thing that I'm really excited about is you see with Bitcoin and some of these other cryptocurrencies, you're seeing a fundamentally new kind of digital asset that's being born that has never existed before. And so, you know, you can maybe pardon some customer friendliness problems because people are inventing things that did not exist, 12 years ago, which is kind of interesting. And so I think as the space matures, and you're already seeing this a little bit, that the customer friendliness will come eventually. But it's just very different, and I think it has many different implications for financial transactions that people actually want to engage in. Many times you do want to have a do-over potentially in some of the transactions, and so it's important to know that that's not how this works.
So it seems like there's a public option, which is sort of where sort of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and some of the more well-known currencies are on, and then a private blockchain, which perhaps Brad's use case would provide a better option. Can one of you describe the sort of difference between a public and private blockchain?
Yeah, so let me start, and then I'll let the computer scientists will do this better job than me. But public blockchain, you should think about Bitcoin as being the example and kind of the first. By the way, a public blockchain is the first time that this concept ever existed. So in 2008, when it was proposed, in 2009 when it actually started, nothing like a public blockchain had been in existence doing real activity previously. Many of the concepts have been borrowed from concepts that had been tried before, but a public blockchain meaning open to anyone. Any of you right now can go and join the Bitcoin network, and no one can tell you that you can't. No government can tell you, no institution can say you're not allowed to use Bitcoin, which is really interesting. Anyone can be a participant and be a miner, and anyone can see and verify the transactions that happen on Bitcoin. So think of it, I think of it as sort of like a public good in a way. It's something that, as I like the Jumbotron and the square idea, I guess. But you can imagine that might not be perfect for everything that you'd want this technology to do. So a private blockchain, I personally think about, I worked at Morgan Stanley for a while before I came to Madison. I don't think Morgan Stanley would ever want any of their transactions on a public blockchain. That makes no sense, because they want to protect the information and the flow of the transactions that they see. They feel that that's part of their competitive advantage in the marketplace. And so what's another solution that might be a bit of a bastardized version of a public blockchain? What's another solution? It's a private blockchain where maybe Morgan Stanley and a couple other banks agree that we'll have this sort of shared database amongst each other that we all will come to consensus on, but we won't open it up to everybody. Brad cannot use it, other people cannot use it, so we'll restrict usage of people can see it, view it, and transact with it. And in that restriction, I think you lose something. So you lose this ability that Bitcoin has to kind of be a place where you don't have to trust anybody and the system still works. That's part of the big innovation, is that I don't have to care who the miners are or if they're going to try to scam me, because I know that they should have an incentive, an economic incentive, to ensure that the blockchain is has as much integrity as possible. On the private blockchain side, you lose a little bit of that, and so I think they're all trade-offs as you think about. I think you should think about the options as public blockchain. Maybe there's a private blockchain, and maybe there's just a regular database, like a centralized database that has worked really well and has done a ton of great things for the world to today. And so, what is the right option? It kind of depends on what you're trying to do, I think. So
you mentioned database, so let's jump into that right now. So from a technical standpoint, what would be the pros and cons of, what would be the best use case for using a traditional database in a business setting versus jumping on and utilizing a blockchain?
So if you want something that is really fast, don't use a blockchain. There are a lot of wonderful things about blockchains, but they are not, at the moment, there are people working on this, but at the moment they are not nearly as scalable, is probably the best way to describe it, as databases. So if you want your transactions to go really quickly, if you want it to just be enormous in general, database is probably the best way to go. A blockchain has certain qualities that make it sometimes better, but that requires an understanding that it won't be nearly as efficient. So anytime you need some kind of coordination where multiple parties are coming together and need to agree on information, then the sacrifices you make by using a blockchain become worth it. But technically it will be slower.
Yeah, and also, I guess like a good reason probably most times where people use blockchains is when they really care about what is called censorship resistance. Because in the traditional financial system, a lot of people at times that we don't know in certain countries are left out of the financial system for several reasons. But what blockchains allow, it gives people the power to access new financial services and new tools that are censorship resistant and gives control back to people, and that's very important reason for like using blockchains. And from more of the enterprise context, for just how it's better than a database is when you have these multiple untrusted parties who traditionally do business and use middlemen to process a lot of their transactions. If you look at the traditional financial system, there's a lot of intermediaries who sort of have to process and manage a movement of data across these different companies. And in those cases, a blockchain could prove to be more efficient from a coordination perspective than a traditional database. But a database, most times for a lot of the applications that people are claiming to use blockchains for, a database would suffice in a lot of use cases.
I don't know anything to add too much to that. Everybody had such good answers. I think of blockchains less as public versus private and more as open versus closed. Same categories pretty much, but I think it's a good way to think about it. And then of course there's a gradient. There is a gradient. There's like federated setups and all these other things. So just that was the only thing I don't think was mentioned. And what was the other follow-up question you had?
We talked about database versus blockchain.
Yeah, I guess. I think blockchains are best used, and to touch on this, when you don't trust any of the other participants in a network. And trust in a network it's a lot of baggage, it's a lot of overhead, for sure. So this can make a lot of potential transactions that could never have been possible become possible to go through. It also allows a lot of transactions that could not be able to co-locate previously. Now they can in digital space without needing to trust each other. And so I think this, another key takeaway that wasn't, I don't think, mentioned was this unlocks a huge amount of value and wealth creation opportunities for our world, for everyone anyone who can have an internet connection, which is, growing number in this world.
Yes, you talk about security. Can you dive in a little deeper on what exactly makes this so secure?
So I think when you have a bunch of different parties that have to agree on something, it makes it much more complicated to change the history. So if I'm a bank, as Brad mentioned, and I want to change something in my database, that's really easy. I just go change it. But if I am running a system with thousands of other people, then we have to agree on how to make that happen. And part of the agreement we've set up is that we won't change things. And so if you're, say, running part of the Bitcoin network, you can't just go back and change the history. Other users will basically flag you, and you can't do that. Which means that things that are stored on a blockchain, to use Will's analogy, are buried deeper and deeper. They're harder and harder to change the longer that they're on the network. Which means that people really like it for a data security perspective. It's really much more difficult to hack a blockchain because you would have to take down more than half of the entire network, which is very different than just taking down one data center. So it becomes much more difficult to attack also.
Have there been cases where a network has been hacked? And if so, can you talk
Sure.
about that?
So most of the blockchain hacks that you hear about are not the actual blockchain. They'll be like something peripheral that's like kind of confusing to users. So for example, when you send cryptocurrency around, it's usually to something called a public address, which is part of cryptography, not relevant, but it just looks like this big string of numbers and letters, and you wouldn't really have a way of knowing if it's correct or not. So there was an ICO, an initial coin offering, where they built a website and they said, okay, send your Ethereum to this address, and they put the address, and then somebody hacked into the website servers and changed the address to their own. So that is technically a blockchain hack, but it wasn't a hack on the blockchain, it was just like a peripheral hack. There have been cases where the blockchain itself was attacked, but they're usually when a network is really small and much more vulnerable. Once you get to the scale of, say, Bitcoin, or even some of the smaller networks, it's pretty safe.
Yeah, a bit deeper into the stack in terms of like hack examples than Roz was going. There's, at least with Ethereum, there's been a number of issues with some of the tools built on top of the base blockchains, often called smart contracts. So there's two big ones that I can really think of that should grab your attention. One was a smart contract kind of app called the DAO, DAO, which stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. So this is kind of like a general term, but they used it as a brand for this one app. And this app was a complex set of smart contracts that acted kind of like a decentralized VC fund, sort of. And it was drained by an attacker who found a vulnerability. And the claim to fame of this project, known as the DAO, was that its code was law. So whatever the code was that was deployed in production was how the app was supposed to run. So what's interesting about this is the question arises, did the hacker run the app? Right? Was he actually a hacker, or was he just a user who found a use case in this app that is decentralized? And so this is what led to Ethereum's forking, which has created Ethereum Classic and Ethereum. This is an incredible, great story if you want to do some history for yourself. There's volumes to read online about it. And so this is a prolific hack of Ethereum, if you will. It's not a hack of its base protocol, but of one of its main apps, and a vulnerability found in the scripting language used to build this app on top of Ethereum. So similarly, another major issue happened last year with a multi-sig implementation, which is a kind of like escrow setup, which can be done, using many different blockchains, including Bitcoin. But with Ethereum, this is especially complicated. And one of its co-founders had written a tool that allowed users to make multi-signature wallets, which are kind of these escrow setups. And an attacker found a vulnerability that basically nuked or locked hundreds of, I don't remember the exact sum, but it was over $100 million worth at the time. And this is prolific because it's still, I believe, stuck. Maybe Sid has more knowledge on the current events of this than I do, but I believe all these funds are still stuck, and there's still a debate, although kind of quieter and not a top priority, it seems, about whether or not to do any sort of drastic update, such as a fork or similar, to allow the people whose funds are locked up to be released. And some of the funds that are locked up belong to these large companies with these large fundraisers in what was called ICOs, right? So those are two big security issues related to blockchain that go beyond like an exchange hack where a business gets hacked and its central servers get hacked, or its central nature gets attacked. suppose it could be argued that these are centralized problems too, but anyway, yeah, those are the two I'm thinking of that are big.
Yeah, I think it's also important to distinguish like what you mean by hacks on the underlying blockchain, right? What Will mentioned were hacks on applications that were built on the blockchain. There are these digital contracts that you can build and write and create these decentralized applications on blockchains like Ethereum. And they had vulnerabilities because the scripting language that's natively baked into the protocol has it does have a lot of attack vectors. If you're not carefully programming it, you could open up a lot of vulnerabilities and let because you're publishing this code online. It's almost like a public bug bounty for a lot of people, which is why at Dharma when we build our contracts, we go through like a very intense like security audit where multiple people are reviewing our code before we publish it. So it's very important to like make sure that you like test your code and make sure that's like not open to any vulnerabilities. But the underlying blockchain itself, the beauty of it is that given that it's a distributed network, since everyone is donating resources to the network, be it computing power or capital or resources, there's a certain threshold that you have to meet in order to actually be able to sort of quote unquote hack the network or be able to gain access, where you can like censor transactions or you can like change the history effectively, the future history of sorts. So for Bitcoin, essentially you have this process of mining where you have multiple people, producing the computational power to secure the network. And if you reach a threshold of 51% or more as someone who can gain that computational power, then you'd be able to, do things like where you can possibly hack it, but essentially block transactions or prevent people from using it and make it hard for people to actually access the network. But a lot of what you need to distinguish here is like there's hacks on the applications built on top of it. There's properties where you can hack the underlying network itself, or you could hack centralized services that are built around these networks, be it exchanges where people can actually buy and sell digital currencies and so on. And a lot of the things that you hear more often are hacks that happen. Companies who are centralized and basically have a provisional service to access these networks.
So we got really technical right there. I just want to let's poll the audience. Let's see how many of you would classify yourself as sort of strong, have a strong knowledge base of sort of the cryptocurrency space, blockchain space. Oh, that's a large chunk of you. What about you know enough just to be dangerous? And then intro, this is your ground level, you're just getting things, you're just starting to read about this space now. Couple? Okay, that's good. So we talked about Bitcoin. You referenced Bitcoin a few times tonight so far, which would, I think earlier you mentioned that was one of the earlier first applications, one of the killer applications on the blockchain back in 2008, 2009. Can you talk a little bit more? There was some terminology thrown out. Will and Sid, you said wallets and exchanges. Can you talk a little bit more about how does one actually acquire Bitcoin and what do you do with it?
Sure. I don't think wallet's the greatest term for this. I think a lot of the nomenclature kind of stinks, like mining, should be burying and all that. But anyway, wallets are, in the cryptographic sense, they're really keychains. And then the wallet software helps you manage all those keys kind of in the background. So maybe they're keychains, or I don't know, but so we're calling them wallets. It's like they should feel like a banking app, in my opinion, in terms of user experience. Should feel like a banking app that you just have full control of these assets as compared to your bank. So if you think of a mobile app, there's a number of wallet products out there that are really good, trustworthy, where you control all the keys. You control the keys yourself. Often called non-custodial wallets because you're the custodian. So, and many major mobile phones are perfectly sufficient for modest sums of storing cryptocurrency on there. I think once you get past maybe $2,000 or $3,000 or $5,000, you should think about upgrading your security from your mobile phone. And what I usually do is just use an old mobile phone or an iPod Touch and, just rarely connected to the internet unless I want to send transactions. I think that's a really great way to use kind of pseudo offline storage and pretty secure user experience for beginners. If you have an old device laying around that you're pretty sure is clean. Otherwise, there's other products out there, like they look like thumbsticks and they're called hardware wallets. And then of course, you can roll your own sort of offline storage as well. And offline storage is a secure way to hold your money, if it's cryptocurrency, and kind of manage it yourself. Because really what we're doing, what the opportunity here with Bitcoin, blockchain, and cryptocurrency and decentralization, if you will, is that we are our own custodians of our own money. So there's a call to responsibility there. We've often enjoyed the outsourcing of this responsibility. And for a while, banks were relatively trustworthy. I don't think they are anymore, although US isn't so bad as other places. But yeah, that we no longer necessarily need to trust groups like that. We can trust ourselves, and we need to re-educate ourselves how to handle that in the digital world. So that's the problem of like security and wallets and user experience. So when I think of kind of differentiating what are these, how do you actually use it, get it, and stuff like that, defining what's a wallet, what's an exchange, and so on. I think it's talking about the security and user experience for this new kind of money, which is the really first killer app of blockchain. So maybe the only app, but not. But, so exchanges are, it's like having a Schwab account or an E-Trade account. You can sign up to various exchanges like this and just know that that's a trust relationship that's probably maybe not as insured as your trust relationship with your bank or brokerage account, but perhaps allows you some business or financial opportunity and upside that those others don't also. So just, I guess, words of caution, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to own your own keys, hold your own keys, and be your own custodian of your own wealth, and learn about what that means for yourself and how you can manage that. And if you find that you won't be able to trust yourself with certain aspects, there are still private and trust minimized ways to get that done for yourself, where you don't need to, say, store it with a third party or trust a third party. So yeah, not your keys, not your coin, hold your own keys. If you're gonna use an exchange, get your money on and off there quick in the same day. And yeah, any day there could be one of these. We haven't had an exchange hack in a long time. Security practices on exchanges are getting really good, but it's a ticking time bomb. So it'll happen again, and yeah, I think that's okay.
And then I would just say that there are multiple options about, to how to, go about getting, cryptocurrency. There's actually a really great centralized option, which is Coinbase. Coinbase is a really important firm in the space. They make the customer experience very, very easy. I always think, when I think about the space, I think about, when is my mom going to feel comfortable enough to go purchase Bitcoin? Coinbase is leading to a space where my mom will feel comfortable, at least that she can transact in a way that makes sense to her. She's not going to get a hardware wallet. She's not going to be her own custodian. She would be a terrible custodian for herself. Because if she loses her private key, she's lost all of her assets. So Coinbase will do that for her. Now, it is a problem in that they are centralized, also FDIC insured, by the way. So they're like a legitimate large company that you might see in the traditional financial world, and that has a lot of benefits for users, even though there's an ethos of this space that says, we don't really want to be trusting those institutions, because the space is kind of about not having institutions like that, but there are those options, and I think they're really good options. So
Yeah, and what's very interesting from my perspective is today we have most of the new users who are being onboarded to crypto or blockchains, can acquire digital assets through centralized exchanges like Coinbase. What's interesting is as we move from this phase where people are getting on-ramped into this new digital economy, and things actually move into utility phase where we can actually use these digital assets for different applications and accessing different financial services, is then when it will be most important that people actually own their digital assets. And like Will mentioned, I think it's very important that people start to understand and actually own their private keys, because that only means then we actually attain a future where like people can actually own their wealth, right? Otherwise, we're just recreating the traditional financial system, like delegating your assets to another entity. So a lot of the user experience has to improve around how people can actually custody their funds and actually making that very intuitive for users to use, so that my mom or grandma can like use it, right? But of course, it's still nascent. What's more interesting is that like as we're transitioning over from on-ramping a lot of the people in this new economy, people are creating new financial services like decentralized exchanges where you don't have to trust a centralized company to actually facilitate exchanges of assets. You can do that peer-to-peer using digital smart contracts, and that's kind of like the future we're like slowly heading to.
So we spent a lot of time talking about the when you're referencing transactions in terms of them being financial, whether it be between individuals locally or an individual across the world or between institutions. What other types of information can be stored on a blockchain? Like what is all in the record as well? Is it just, can it only be between transactions? Can I put photos? Can it be physical assets? Can you trade physical assets on a blockchain? Or is it only monetary?
So technically, you can store anything. There are a bunch of decentralized versions of things you're familiar with. The most relevant probably being something called IPFS, which stands for the Interplanetary File System, which has something called Filecoin, which is basically distributed file storage. So that's just like regular data. Anything you would have in your Google Drive, you could do on there. You can trade physical goods. There's something which people usually refer to as the Oracle problem, which is basically if you have something in the physical world, you need a way of getting the information about that thing, like who owns it, onto a blockchain. So like if you own a house and you want to certify that you own that house, you can just say you own the house. Like I could say I own your house and like nobody would really know the difference. So it gets a little more complicated. People are working on how to resolve that. But like technically you could store that information on a blockchain and it would work.
Yeah, just to add to that, yeah, you could, so depending on like what blockchain you're using, you could have monetary transactions, or you could have sort of arbitrary instruments being tradable. You could have assets that represent you could have assets that represent physical assets in the real world, or you could have digital assets that are created sort of as like collectibles. So one of the sort of popular applications that was built on Ethereum and something that was like kind of like got a lot of like interest from the mainstream user base was something called Cryptokitties. So people actually built like versions of digital cats, and as a way to represent how you can create collectibles on the blockchain and have them tradable as like non-fungible assets, where each asset is its own unique copy, and people could create scarcity and value in these assets, right? So you could create arbitrary types of instruments, be it just pure money or complex financial instruments, or wonky things like collectibles and so on.
I want to touch on that before we move on. The really cool thing about something like unique digital collectibles that's different from like the way the internet has been run forever is that one of the fundamental innovations about the internet was that you could infinitely copy things, right? We can now spread information, and that's amazing, but that means you have no idea like where it comes from or which is the original or anything like that. Now we have, with some cryptography and blockchain stuff, ways of having unique assets online that cannot be copied. If you have a copy, it would be evident in that actual asset, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, there's, I guess, should definitely be mentioned that, you know, one of the first things stored in any blockchain was a message from the creator of Bitcoin. There was a headline from a newspaper in the UK about the Chancellor being on the brink of another bailout for the banks. So the ethos is stamped in the what's known as the Genesis block, the first block of Bitcoin's blockchain, the deepest block in the grave. So that's a message. It's just text. It's stored in the blockchain. It's probably maybe the most famous data stored in the blockchain. And then there's other things people have tried to do, like storing nasty things in the blockchain, probably to give Bitcoin a bad name. That's kind of useless. So it's just like a cosmetically terrible thing. But these are the things that can be stored in Bitcoin's blockchain. There's a function in the blockchain, in Bitcoin's blockchain, called an opcode, which allows you to do more than just send money in the blockchain. So there's a number of functions that can be done using different opcodes.
So Brett, what's one of your favorite applications of something that's been stored on the blockchain? Are you a fanboy of anything in particular that's out in the market right now?
You know, I'm really curious about Augur and the possibility of these decentralized prediction markets. I'm not necessarily convinced that it's going to be a real workable solution at scale, but I'm very curious, and I certainly want to support the experimentation of seeing if it works. So this idea that you could have users coming together in a decentralized way, determining one, what are we predicting? Two, how do we know if that prediction actually comes true or not? And then third, exchange the value, when that does happen, all in a way where you don't have to have any one person sitting on top. I think it's a sort of, there's a lot about the space that's really interesting from an organizational design perspective, and that's one that I'm very curious about. So they have mechanisms that they believe create economic incentives to ensure that the truth is gathered from the outside world and put into Augur, but it is perhaps not infallible system. We'll see over time. But the biggest thing I want to make sure, what I'm curious about there though, is I want to see real predictions that matter for people and not simply like gaming kind of predictions. Like you and I could say, we think who's going to win the World Series and things like that, which I think they're fine and they're interesting. But real prediction markets where people can like hedge things that matter and that are of importance that banks would never do because they can't get the large players to get around it. I think banks will provide any hedging options that large players want them to do, but this decentralized prediction markets allows the small players to have a voice in what is an important prediction. And so I think that's really interesting. Now the question is, will it be used in those productive ways, or is it more of a gaming kind of idea? So
you all seem to be very well-versed, educated in this space. What are some of your favorite resources to learn about some advancements in the technology?
I really like, so I'm trying to compile some of those resources, and many people on the panel are as well, but one of the things is the A16Z has this crypto canon. If you just Google A16Z crypto canon, they've collected what they believe are the best thought pieces around a ton of different topics. I think that's great. You can go there and spend literally like weeks going through everything that they have there. I think that's great. I think they're a podcast that can really help people think about it in a way that's like a little bit more approachable. Sort of like Laura Shin's podcast called Unchained. I think it's always a kind of a fun discussion, I think, that she has on there, but I'm sure there are a bunch of others.
Yeah, and just going off the list that Brad mentioned from ACCC, I think the best way to start is to acquire knowledge about how Bitcoin works. I think like blockchain wouldn't exist without Bitcoin actually coming into existence. So it's very important to start there, understand kind of the mechanics behind that, and of course, like if you want to go into technical weeds, you can definitely start with the Bitcoin white paper. It is pretty dense. I mean, it's 8 pages, but you can probably sift through that. And there's a lot of content online if you want to get like a high-level explanation. There's a lot of people out there educating the masses. So you can look at Andreas Antonopoulos for getting more up to speed on Bitcoin. And then once you pass through that, there's also like books available, online courses on Coursera, which you can probably look at if you want to go more deeper. And then of course just acquiring some digital currency and actually using it and sending it to your friends and family is a good way to learn, because you might make some mistakes, you might try to understand small concepts, and then you might go down the rabbit hole. I think the best way to start is like find a resource and then go from there, look at the references, and then pass through that. But of course, if you want a high-level explanation, there's a lot of podcasts and videos and stuff that you can access online.
So I'm a big fan of a Bitcoin core developer and entrepreneur in the space known as Jameson Lopp. His website is lopp.net. I think his Bitcoin knowledge base is, again, very similar to A16Z's Canon, but I think it's got even more. It sort of looks like Drudge Report with all the links, right? But it's an incredible resource, and again, very Bitcoin heavy. So great place to start, and tons of stuff for Andreas is on there. So I believe the site is lopp.net/bitcoin.html. And that'll give you right to that wall, the wallpaper of all the hyperlinks that you can just cruise through. And again, it'll take you weeks, but it's, you'll be like the rest of us. At some point, we all spent like sleepless nights for 3 months on end, digging into this stuff.
I think one of the coolest things about this space is because it's not really run by any company that can like hide the information behind a paywall. It's all open. So a good place to start is the Bitcoin white paper. If you find it's too technical, just like Google the terms you don't know, take a step back, tweet at me, I'll answer you. Or like basically anything you come across, you can find something about it online. It's all open, which is really amazing. And the industry is pretty small and accessible still. And so if you have questions, people are pretty responsive. If you're like, hey, I don't really understand what a private key is, like someone please explain it to me, they'd be more than happy to. And I found that's a really great way to learn. The other thing I'll say is there's a lot to take in, and when you first start looking at this stuff, it can be very overwhelming. And so just taking like a weekend and like clear your schedule and just read for several days, and then you'll feel much better about yourself. In the beginning, you'll just have a lot of questions and feel very disoriented, and then once you kind of overcome that first jump, and you know where to start looking after that, it becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, and also just to add to that, there's local resources in Madison, like the Madison Blockchain Meetup and Badger Blockchain at the university. A lot of like how I got started into blockchain just like was meeting people and having like in-person conversations, right? And if you do have interesting thoughts or questions, it's always best to have a community around you. And I think the community around here at the state or at the university is something that you should definitely tap into if you want to like learn more and be involved. I think that's like the best way. And then of course, like as you meet people, they share resources and then you bounce off ideas. So that's like the best way, I think, to get started without spending a lot of time if you don't have much time on your hands.
So what are some loose predictions you have or hopes for the next few years?
I hope that people stop thinking that Bitcoin is broken. I think there's still a bit of a perception that it's like this scary illegal thing. And that's changing a little bit, but I hope we see it much more as like a really powerful tool, rather than like some scary thing that's trying to, ruin the government or something like that.
Why? Why would people give up that thought?
Why would people give that up?
Give that thought up.
Why would that? What rational basis is there for dispelling that belief or myth?
I think it takes a lot of conversations like this where we talk about the powers that it has, and I think being reasonable about what we're trying to accomplish with using tools like this, I think there's a lot of really amazing advantages to using this technology that don't have to overthrow government, that can be used for good, and that's something worth exploring.
I hope Ross Ulbricht is freed. That's my prediction. It's unconscionable that someone who built a website is serving 2 life sentences plus 40 years for nonviolent crimes.
I think like I'm more interested in the ability to actually create more universally accessible and fair open like financial system. And I think what would be cool, and I think this should happen probably, would be for banks to actually adopt decentralized technologies rather than using their own proprietary technologies for blockchain if they wanted to. So I see a future where we might still have banks, but probably these institutions actually adopting digital currencies and like the new economy that's forming, and more so adopting to the change that's happening right now. And I do see a future where people will actually have utility in transacting digital assets like Bitcoin and so on for real world use cases, and actually use that much more beyond just a store of value and actually have utility for it. So that's like the future I'm interested about. And I'm actually interested in having legacy institutions actually forced into adopting a lot of the new technologies.
Yeah, one thing, sorry, last topic is, so there have been a lot of these initial coin offerings, which in the world of finance are just really odd and confusing, kind of crowdsourced funding for some of these projects. But literally, many of these projects have raised billions, like many millions of dollars and billions of dollars. I think in this world, that's equivalent to sort of unlimited resources. So I want to see, what do I want to see in the next period of time? I want to see these rock star developers who now have unlimited resources build something that is going to like really change how we actually interact. And now they have the resources, they have the like platform. Now there has to be some deliver. Like they have to deliver that. And so that's where I'm like curious to see. So.
And just like a final point, I think a lot of people who come into the blockchain space are starting companies or building things, or branding it and marketing it so that we're trying to bank the unbanked or do sort of things. But in a lot of cases, that actually is not happening today. A lot of the populations of unbanked are still financially illiterate, don't know about cryptocurrencies, don't know about blockchains, don't know how they can use these tools. So I'm excited for the future where we can actually make that a reality, where these people can like access these financial services and actually get to use them. Because a lot of it right now is still nascent, and it will take time. And I'm excited for the future where we can have a future where like people can have access to this like new financial economy, and the people who actually really deserve it today.
I guess I just want to echo Sid real quick. I predict that before the end of the year, there will be a proof of concept deployed that will serve that population, even here in the US.
It's great foreshadowing. So I have one final question, but before I get to that, I'm going to go to the audience. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask the panelists? Yeah, you in the middle.
I have one. So Bitcoin works on like a proof of work type concept. I know Ethereum, I don't know if they've changed already or they're in the works of moving to like a proof of stake. Could you kind of explain the differences between what those two things are?
Real quick, proof of work pulls real world energy and uses that to secure the blockchain. So there's a real expense being paid. There's a real skin in the game. Proof of stake, there's also skin in the game, it seems, but there's no tether to kind of our sun, so to speak.
I'll frame that slightly differently. That proof of stake uses resources that are entirely self-contained. So you're taking a part of a blockchain and then putting it somewhere else in that blockchain so that the blockchain itself can run better, rather than taking resources from the real world and then putting them, converting them into a blockchain power. You want more details on that?
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to kind of sum that up, from a technical standpoint, proof of stake, the network has security based on the capital that is deployed to manage how the consensus is formed. So it is a measure of the capital that is deployed, and the value of the consensus comes from how much resources you're allocating to it. The resources that are allocated to proof of work comes from the energy that you are willing to lose to actually support the network. And both systems have economic incentives built around it, and we'll see how proof of stake systems evolve. They're still in the works, and Ethereum still has a long way to actually implement it.
The only other difference I'd like to point out is that proof of stake systems, I may have this somewhat wrong, but proof of stake has been around far longer than proof of work, as I understand it in computer science history. So we've really seen proof of work emerge with Bitcoin itself. And there have been other, I guess, similar models to proof of stake previous. So.
Any other questions in the audience? Yeah, you in the back?
Legally, are there any concerns with any of the blockchains out there today? Like, from what I understand, money issuance itself is a big legal concern. So, Bitcoin gets run up because the issuer is unknown. But are there any legal concerns about any of these other cryptocurrencies where, the issuer is known or anything like that?
Well, I certainly think we're working through that regulatory landscape as an industry right now. But some interesting notes just to kind of color this question. Major exchanges will not list your coin if you're an anonymous creator or issuer. So in today's day and age, a Bitcoin could not be listed on a Binance or Bittrex or Poloniex or whatever, which is interesting to think about. So perhaps it's better to be a known issuer, and the regulatory clearing will be made so that issuers can do this more easily going forward, or more clearly and transparently for the whole industry going forward. The only other thing I'll say is I think everyone should resist the urge to issue their own money. You have to have a really huge network already, maybe, to justify issuing a money. And most app developers don't have that, let alone other issuers maybe. But I think it's just important rule of thumb in general to just, as we've seen with our monetary policies in this country and certainly in other countries these days as well, resist the urge to issue money.
I'm no legal expert, but I think that privacy coins, if you're not familiar, things like Monero or Zcash, that use different privacy schemes to hide who is sending money and receiving money and how much money, are the scariest to the government, because they can't know if people are printing things or laundering things or anything like that. Anything that scares the government, they don't like those. I don't think they like Bitcoin either, but not as scary.
I think we had a question in the back as well.
Got a question. How do we make the blockchain scalable and accessible, especially to non-techies? I was working on downloading a decentralized social media platform last night, and it was literally 16 steps. Your average person is not going to do that.
Everything out there that's being deployed right now is really rough and raced to production, if you ask me, if it's even reached production. The scaling problems are massive right now, so lots of consumer level applications just aren't possible for, let's say, great scale, even a modest social network, right? So I think it's easy to get our hopes up with the promises that a lot of these companies and ideas and projects and evangelists bring forward. We get our hopes up with the message they're packaging and selling, basically. And we're disappointed upon delivery because everything's so immature. So I think we need to make sure that we're realizing that if you're interested in this stuff, you are a community member, it's kind of incumbent on you at this early stage to help it along, even just rooting for it on Twitter, whatever. So it's easy to be disappointed by a lot of this, and I am too on a daily basis when I look at projects I've been following for years and see their, product deployments, and they're very underwhelming. So take that with a grain of salt, but the way we get there, I think, is following the example of, the mother coin. The stewards of Bitcoin's core are, I think, doing a really fantastic job of preserving its possibility to reach that scale, right? They're preserving that possibility in a number of ways we don't need to argue about tonight, but and I think a lot of technologists, including many of us here at 100 State, are working on helping that progress.
Yeah, I think there's two verticals to your question. I think one is the user experience, and the second part is scaling the underlying blockchain. So, to your concern on user experience, face a lot of that at work, and just thinking about those problems from the longer term, actually see real world adoption. So a lot of the main activity that we see today is people who are very crypto literate, so understand it really well, and like yourself, who can figure that out. So I think it will take time where we have better user-friendly wallets that are more accessible for people to use, as well as better user interfaces for these applications that you're accessing, and also better educational tools that come along by using these applications, and prompts that help you through these processes. So yeah, going through 16 steps is not a good way to actually have a new digital economy run by blockchains, and I think that's fundamentally not a good way to have mainstream adoption for a lot of use cases. But I think over time, as we build these user-facing wallets or whatever applications designed better, it could work. From a scaling standpoint, I think a lot of people are experimenting solutions, more so not on the underlying layer of the blockchain, but trying to go up a couple layers and build solutions where they don't have to reach consensus on the underlying ledger. They can build solutions where you could have payment-specific scaling solutions, or you could have scaling solutions that use models from sharding traditional databases and so on, and then applying that to blockchains. And a lot of that is still experimental; it's not ready for use. But of course, on Bitcoin you have something called Lightning, where you can effectively move off your Bitcoin to this another layer and then transact there, and then if you want to come back to the existing underlying blockchain, you can move your assets back there in a trustless fashion. And, you can do that on Ethereum too in the future. So I think scaling is still in progress, and we'll see a lot of interesting developments happen in the next 1 to 3 years with both new blockchains coming out with different scaling solutions, as well as existing ones being built on top of the current blockchains that exist today.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about what your thoughts are. We've heard a couple different viewpoints on the idea of not having custodians, so you mentioned people actually owning their own digital assets versus how your mom should not own her own digital assets. I'm trying to think, there's almost nothing else I have in my life, my credit card, my checkbook, my driver's license, even the title to my car or the title to my home, that I can't really get another copy of if I lose a copy I have. With the digital currency, that's not true. If I have a hardware wallet and I lose it, it's gone. There's no retrieving it. So I'm curious about your different perspectives on how that becomes, how we factor that in the evolution of this space and more broader consumer adoption. Do you see people becoming more responsible? Do you see more of the Coinbases and the custodians and the exchanges, that becoming a more dominant way, which, as you said, kind of goes against the ethos of the whole movement and creating another financial system on top of it, or recreating it, I guess. What are your
Yeah, so I have a big view on this, which is that the more purity that you're trying to keep in the crypto space, the purity being completely decentralized, by the way, which not a lot of projects are actually decentralized, self-custody so that you're responsible. The more purity to this ideology, I think the lower mainstream adoption. I think then you're developing a product for just a small niche group of people that are mostly technologists that think this is really cool and really like this. But what that means, I think, is that by definition, society misses out on a lot of these benefits because they're not the technologists that understand the purest vision for what these things are, and probably hold off on the custodian thing and hold off on some of these other purist concepts, even the concept of decentralization at times. So I think it's good. I think Coinbase is the way to get my mom into this thing. And then if you can build that and then move forward from there to some of these more purist steps, if you can justify why those purist steps are really important once another solution is kind of there, I think that's the way to have a broader base impact on society. So that's just my view. I think a lot of people will say that they hate that viewpoint.
Sure.
But
No.
that's a practical viewpoint.
I think that's pretty on, for sure. Just a bit deeper than that, I think what the Bitcoin Core developers and the stewards of the Bitcoin Core protocol have been up to is preserving the best defaults. And what I see is we definitely need to do what Brad is saying as an industry, create these good user experiences. And what we see right now as a wave in the industry is a lot of custodial solutions coming into place, specifically to serve institutional capital that is looking to enter the space but has mandates for certain custodianship with their existing models, and they need a third-party custodian that's registered, trusted, and all this stuff. So custody solutions are being built today for the sake of scaling Bitcoin, not just to mom and pop and Main Street, but to institutions, Wall Street, London, Tel Aviv, and Hong Kong, and so on. And both need to happen, but in my view, this fails if we don't have these best defaults preserved, which allow for the openness and allow for the technologists to have people to opt into complete custody of their own keys and fully validating nodes and so on. On top of these things, there's just tons of value that can be built, tons and tons of businesses, existing business models that are obvious to us, new business models that have never been invented yet, and these can all, it'll be a pendulum swing. We're right now in the part of the swing going towards more custody because we had this huge wave of like 20 million people come into the space in the last like 9 or 10 months, and all the exchanges went down and blocked new users because they had to catch up, right? Including Coinbase. And they are probably the best equipped maybe to deal with it, and even they couldn't. So custody solutions definitely need to be there for obvious reasons, but I think once, like Sid was saying, once you get your first taste, it's a good learning experience to get your first crypto, you're going to kind of go down a rabbit hole of sorts, and maybe you don't read Lop's entire website or the Crypto Canon on A16Z's site, but you send some transactions back and forth, you move your coin from Coinbase onto a mobile wallet that's like super slick, but you actually control your keys, and then you see what else you can do. So it's a pendulum swing. We're right now heading towards more custody because of the mass influx of new users that have come in and the interest that's around. And there will be, for some who need these use cases, they need to be preserved. The privacy use cases, the full autonomy use cases, full custody, etc., need to be preserved and available. And that's what I think was won in the past year, which allowed for this huge influx of new users. This battle of we didn't really talk about it at all, but the whole like Bitcoin scaling battle that resulted in the fork of Bitcoin. We mentioned Ethereum's fork. But no, I totally agree with Brad. And it's important that we still have all of the ethos at the core of the protocol remains.
I totally agree that the cypherpunk libertarian thing is not gonna make it to the mainstream. I think it's great, and I'm glad that it exists, and I think that it's been an awesome testing ground. But I think for things to hit mass scale, we need a better user experience. We can't keep trying to overthrow the government. Like that's just not gonna fly. I think one thing that will really help people trust institutions like Coinbase is if legislation becomes much clearer. At this point in time, it's still a little bit scary to like put your money on an exchange because they're not really regulated. It's getting a little better. Like we haven't had a hack too recently, but there was definitely a big phase like 2014, 2015 of these like mom and pop exchanges. It's like, oh, want to go start a crypto exchange like in our basement, make a little money, which is like really not a good way to have, you know, part of our global financial system. So things are getting a little better built and a little better regulated. But once that's at a point where regular users can feel like they can trust those institutions, then we can have a more like of a compromised point where there's a little bit of like custodial stuff, but it feels safer and you're like okay putting your money in these institutions because it's actually much more usable. And I would love to see things like decentralized exchanges make it to mainstream, but that requires a huge jump from where we are in user experience, and there are just too many things at this point that are fundamentally different from how we've operated for so long. Like just using private keys is not something people are generally accustomed to, and so if you're a designer, please come work for a crypto company. We need you.
Designer.
Yeah, it's a big mess. I think Coinbase has really done a good job trying to make that as easy as possible for their users. They have a great blog. Their head of design is awesome. They work really hard to make it easy for people because they realize that's how people will join. But we're still sort of in this like weird place where we can't quite do that for everything. Nobody really wants to like put their Bitcoin in these random companies. Yeah, it's a little scary still. So probably eventually that's what it will look like for a lot of people. I think there will always be these kind of like weird OG Bitcoin people who will like want to keep their stuff because they just feel safer that way. But I think that's true of most tech. There's a lot of like, you know, not everyone uses Linux, but some people really want like to super customize whatever they're doing, and they know it well enough that they're fine with that. And I think that'll be true of people's money and data as well.
So unfortunately, we're out of time to take any additional questions, but the panelists will be available afterwards for a few minutes, so feel free to connect with them then. But before we wrap, I want to ask one more question, and probably the most important question I'm going to ask today. Do you have any blockchain jokes? Brad, I heard you have a great one that you're dying to share.
No, I did hear one recently, which was that what's the quickest way to become like a crypto millionaire? So start off as a crypto billionaire.
I used to have a good one, but I butcher it all the time now. I can't. But it's something along the lines of, what is a blockchain? It's I'm gonna butcher this, but it's a vehicle for consultants to make millions. Something. It's like, you know, it's a word consultants use to make a lot of money.
Yeah. Do you have any blockchain jokes?
Yeah. I do, but I don't think we have enough time to talk about my blockchain joke, but we can hash the details later. Thank you everybody for joining us.